Ever get that feeling? Like you're drowning in information, but you're just like dying for that one big idea, that one concept that just kind of pulls everything together.
Oh, absolutely. That search for a unifying principle, right?
Well, today we're diving into something that just might be that for you. It's a concept called the universal level.
Okay, universal level. I like it.
Yeah, and our material defines it as, get this, in the universe, every entity can be referred to as a level, and it can be associated with each one.
So anything and everything, basically.
Whether it has structure or not, whether it has a name or is nameless, whether it is meaningful or meaningless, it is called a level.
Wow, it's pretty wide open, isn't it?
Wide open is an understatement.
Yeah.
So what we're going to do today is figure out, like, what does it even mean to see every single thing, absolutely everything, as a level connected by associations?
That's a tall order, but it's a fascinating one. I mean, just think about the potential implications if this idea actually holds up.
Right. It could be huge. So let's start with a little bit of historical context. How have humans traditionally tried to, impose some kind of order on the universe?
Well, one of the earliest examples that comes to mind is the Great Chain of Being.
Right. The great chain of being, this hierarchical view of like everything.
Exactly. A very rigid hierarchy with, God at the top and then angels, humans, animals, plants, and finally inanimate matter at the bottom.
Yeah, like a cosmic ladder, sort of.
Mhm.
And our source mentions the Neoplatonic hierarchy too as another model.
Yes, and the Neoplatonic hierarchy was a bit more sophisticated. It envisioned a series of levels emanating from a single source, the One. Each level was a bit less perfect, a bit further removed from that original unity.
Hmm. Interesting. So not so much a ranking, but more about how everything came from this one ultimate source.
That's right. But what's interesting here is that both of these models, they kind of imply a hierarchy of value. Like some levels are better, more perfect, closer to the divine than others.
Right. And that's not really what our listeners' definition is getting at. They're saying everything's a level,
Yeah.
period. No judgment calls.
Exactly. And modern philosophy, it really pushes back on those rigid hierarchies. We have concepts like scale and quasi-levels now, which offer more flexible ways to understand how things relate, especially in complex systems where new properties can emerge.
So it's less about a fixed order and more about understanding the relationships and interactions.
Right. And this brings us to another interesting point. How do we even categorize existence in the first place? Philosophy traditionally talks about singular and general, concrete and abstract.
Yeah, trying to put things in neat little boxes.
Exactly. But this universal level idea, it kind of throws all of that out the window, doesn't it? It just labels everything as a level, regardless of those traditional categories.
Which is a very different approach than what we see in science. Like, think about taxonomy in biology, right? That's all about meticulously categorizing living organisms based on shared characteristics.
Right. A very structured hierarchy from domain all the way down to species. But taxonomy's focus is on organizing life based on evolutionary relationships. It's not trying to label everything in the universe as a level.
Yeah, so we've got ontology, trying to understand being, taxonomy, trying to classify life, and then this universal level concept, which is like its own thing entirely.
Yeah, it's offering a completely different perspective, one that highlights the potential connections between entities, regardless of how we categorize them.
So, okay, how might this level idea actually play out in different scientific fields?
Well, let's take computer science, for example. They talk about levels of abstraction, different ways of looking at a complex system, like a software program. Each level focuses on a different aspect of that system's functionality.
So it's kind of like zooming in and out, getting different levels of detail.
Exactly. A programmer can work on high-level code without needing to know all the nitty-gritty details of the underlying hardware. And that actually aligns quite well with the universal level idea, doesn't it? Like, we can understand entities at different levels of detail, but they're all still connected somehow.
And then you've got like the concept of Turing completeness, which defined a fundamental level of computational power.
Right. Anything that can simulate a Turing machine is considered to be at that same level of computational capability.
Okay, so how about physics? I mean, we see a pretty clear hierarchy there, right? From tiny particles all the way up to the vast cosmic web.
Absolutely. And each of those could be seen as a level in this framework. And what are the associations in this case? Well, the fundamental forces, of course. Gravity, for instance, operates across these levels, governing the interactions of planets, stars, galaxies.
Right, so you've got Newton's law of gravitation working on like apples falling from trees and planets orbiting stars. Same basic force at play, just different scales.
And then there's the standard model of particle physics, which describes these fundamental levels of matter and energy.
And even in the social sciences, we analyze things at different levels, like micro, meso, and macro, right? Individuals, communities, and societies.
Exactly. And the associations in this case would be the social interactions and structures that link these levels. In fact, systems theory, with its interconnected micro, meso, exo, macro systems, really echoes this idea of interdependent levels influencing each other.
Okay, so we've seen how this universal level idea can be applied in a bunch of different fields, but there are some tricky questions too, right? Like the definition includes both structured things, like a molecule, and potentially unstructured things, like a fundamental particle. Does the idea of a level really hold the same weight for both? I mean, they're so different.
That's a great point. I mean, the nature of a fundamental particle versus a complex molecule, they're worlds apart. And their associations are also totally different fundamental forces versus chemical bonds. So it really makes you wonder if the term level is even useful across such vastly different entities.
And what about meaning? The definition says meaningful or meaningless levels. Does simply existing qualify something as a level, regardless of whether it has a purpose or a value?
That's another big question. I mean, maybe meaning isn't something inherent in a level, but something that emerges through the interactions, through those associations. Think about individual atoms, right? On their own, they might seem kind of meaningless, but they combine to form incredibly meaningful structures like DNA.
So meaning could be relative, context-dependent. It's not necessarily baked into the level itself.
Right. And this really highlights how crucial those associations are in this whole concept. They're the glue that holds it all together.
Yeah, like causality, for example. That's a clear form of association where one level directly influences another.
And focusing on those connections, those interactions, is really key to understanding how complex systems work, how they develop emergent properties, new behaviors that arise from the interactions of those constituent levels.
So, okay, we've covered a lot of ground here. It seems like this universal level idea, it's a very broad way of looking at the universe, seeing it as this vast network of interconnected entities, but it's also kind of vague, isn't it? Like, what exactly are these associations? How do we define them? How do we measure them?
Yeah, there are definitely a lot of open questions, but maybe that's part of what makes this concept so intriguing. It gives us a new lens to look through, a new way to approach understanding the universe.
Right. It challenges us to think about the connections, the relationships between things, rather than just trying to categorize them or rank them.
Exactly. So here's a final thought for you. Imagine you're looking at the universe through this universal level lens. What would you see? What surprising connections might you find between seemingly unrelated things?
Yeah, what unexpected associations are lurking out there, just waiting to be discovered? It's definitely something to think about.
It certainly is.
So that's it for our deep dive into the universal level. Hopefully you found it thought-provoking.
It's been a pleasure exploring this with you.
And we'll see you next time for another deep dive into some fascinating topic or another.
Until then.